The FIRE movement. Financial independence, retire early. In the early 2010s, this was the financial idea that millions of people organized their entire lives around. Aggressive savings, index funds, and attempting their best to leave the workforce before the age of 40. Then, fairly quietly, the entire movement seemed to just fade away. The mainstream conversation seems to have moved on, but the philosophy behind the idea itself still remains. But I have a theory about where the movement has shifted to nowadays. To understand where they all went, you have to understand where it all began from. Now, FIRE as a movement did not have a single origin point, but if you're looking for a sort of founding moment, most people might point you towards a certain book called Your Money or Your Life, published in 1992 by Vicki Robin, and later the blog of a man called Peter Adini, perhaps better known online as Mr. Money Mustache. He documented his entire process of achieving an early retirement, and essentially turned frugal living into an entire philosophy with a bit of a cult following. Were you ever in your FIRE era, or perhaps you know somebody who actually managed to achieve it? Let me know down in the comments below. The core idea was simple enough. Save an aggressive percentage of your income, typically 50, 60, or even 70% for the most hardcore adherents. Invest in low-cost index funds, and once your assets hit roughly 25 times your annual expenses, you would theoretically live off of the returns indefinitely, drawing down 4% per year. This is known as the 4% rule, derived from the Trinity Study, a 1998 piece of research that backtested historical portfolio withdrawal rates and concluded that 4% was broadly sustainable over a 30-year retirement horizon. But FIRE wasn't just a financial strategy, it was a reaction to the idea you were supposed to work 40 years, retire at 65, and enjoy whatever was left. FIRE people looked at that arrangement and decided it was a bad deal. The movement attracted a specific type of person, analytically minded, often in tech or finance, and willing to make significant sacrifices now in exchange for a better life later. And it spawned an entire ecosystem of sub-movements. Fat FIRE for people who wanted to retire early but still live comfortably. Lean FIRE for the more austere crowd willing to live on very little. Barista FIRE, where you semi-retire but keep a part-time job to cover basic costs. Coast FIRE, where you save aggressively early and then let compounding do the rest. The movement had its own language, its own subreddits, its own celebrity bloggers. At its peak, this was a genuinely mainstream cultural moment. Now, why did the math stop working? Well, here's where the story gets a whole lot more complicated. And that's because the whole 4% rule was never quite as universally true as the entire FIRE movement treated it. The Trinity Study that produced it was based on purely US-based historical market data, applied to portfolios of US stocks and bonds, and stress tested again only against US inflation figures. Now, if you were an American investor, the math broadly worked out for you, but if you lived anywhere else, the picture was a whole lot murkier. European markets, for instance, have historically underperformed US markets over the long run. The tax structures are different, the currency dynamics are different, and that matters. FIRE, as originally conceived, was fundamentally an American product built for Americans on American assumptions. But even for those Americans, the post-2020 environment stress-tested the model in ways the Trinity Study could never have anticipated. Asset prices surged in major Western cities, meaning the cost of accumulating the initial portfolio just kept climbing. The number people needed to reach 25 times their annual expenses kept moving upward because annual expenses themselves kept moving upward. The goalposts were moving faster than the people could run. And there was a more fundamental issue. For the median person, FIRE math has always required either an unusually high income or an unusually low cost of living, or perhaps both. The people who actually retired early were statistically not the average person reading those blogs. They were already relatively well off. FIRE as a mass movement was in some ways a product that was always more accessible to the people who needed it the least. By the 2020s, that cultural moment had passed. Now, the mainstream conversation may have moved on, but there are still many people out there who internalize the core philosophies that you could engineer your life outside of the default script by making intentional financial decisions. Those people are still out there trying to find ways to make it all work. And that's where it gets interesting, because if you can't retire because the numbers you would have to reach are simply too large, there is another lever that you could pull. You don't have to increase your assets to where 4% of it could cover your life in London or Berlin. You could reduce the expenses of your life till your assets or your income cover your life elsewhere. Basically, geographic arbitrage. The same capital applied in a cheaper context suddenly makes the math work. Now, retirees have been moving to cheaper countries for decades. That part is not new, but there is a meaningful difference between what traditional retirees abroad were doing and what happened next. The retiree moving to Portugal or Thailand was living off savings or a pension. They had already stopped earning. What changed with the rise of remote work and internet-based income is that a new type of person could move to a cheaper country and keep earning at the same time, benefiting from a far lower cost of living without having to first wait until they had accumulated enough savings to retire and draw them down to zero. You no longer had to simply live off of your savings, you just needed an income that was portable. And the global pandemic accelerated exactly that shift. Remote work was normalized almost overnight for a class of workers who previously had no path to location independence. The infrastructure for the nomad life already existed, and for a specific type of person already primed by the thinking of the FIRE movement to view their finances as an engineering problem rather than a fixed reality, discovered that you did not need to fully retire to benefit from this. You just needed remote income. $1,000 a month in Manchester is poverty. In Chiang Mai in 2021, it was a reasonable life. A Western salary applied to Southeast Asia could generate a standard of living that felt like the FIRE dream without requiring the same portfolio. The numbers that never quite worked at home suddenly work abroad. And so the digital nomad movement, which had existed in smaller form before, exploded. A meaningful chunk of the people flooding into Bali, Chiang Mai, or Lisbon were not 22-year-olds looking for adventure. They were people who had done the FIRE spreadsheets, found them wanting, and were ready to reach for the next available tool. Now, I've discussed in my previous videos how I believe that the modern digital nomad is quite far away from that laptop on a beach archetype, and far closer to what I would call an economic refugee. Someone who's using geographic and currency arbitrage not as a lifestyle choice, but rather out of survival necessity. And I believe that framing fits perfectly here. That's because the FIRE movement at its core was a response to a system that felt it was handing you an increasingly bad deal. Both ideas, I believe, attract the same type of person. In fact, I would say both are spiritually aligned in that sense. The method has changed, the underlying sensibilities have not. So that's where it leaves us. The FIRE movement is not exactly dead. These subreddits still exist. People out there are still running the numbers, but it is certainly no longer the cultural force it was back in 2015. The economic conditions that made it actually feel like something that was achievable for the average person have sadly shifted. The math got a lot harder, and the movement ultimately contracted back to those who had ultimately served the best. But the philosophy, sacrifice now, make intentional choices, and engineer your way toward a life with more optionality, that didn't go anywhere. It just found a new vehicle, and a good number of the people carrying the torch are currently sitting in a co-working space somewhere in Southeast Asia, earning in dollars or euros and spending in local currency, running more or less the same calculation their FIRE counterparts were running a decade ago. The spreadsheets might be different. The question, however, is the same. Is there a smarter way to do this than just going along with what everyone else is doing? I don't think that question is going away anytime soon. Do you agree that the modern digital nomad movement carries the same spirit as the FIRE movement did back then? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for watching.